In a world that measures worth by the loudness of your presence, Lyra Ashenfall had learned to exist in whispers. At 22, she carried herself like an apology, shoulders curved inward, eyes that found the floor more often than faces, hands that fluttered nervously when she spoke as if her words might somehow take up too much space. Born Omega in a city that treated the designation like a diagnosis, she had spent her life accepting the unspoken verdict that she was meant to accommodate, not choose, to be grateful for scraps, not hungry for more. The community shelter where she worked smelled of disinfectant and second chances, filled with creatures whose stories mirrored her own. The unwanted, the overlooked, the ones who had learned that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Each day, she watched families walk past the kennels with predetermined ideas of what love should look like: young, beautiful, perfect. Each day, she understood a little more about invisibility, but understanding and accepting are different creatures entirely. On the afternoon that would change everything, Lyra stood before a kennel in the forgotten corner of the shelter, looking into eyes that reflected her own quiet resignation. The pup inside wasn't performing for attention like the others. He wasn't barking or wagging or offering the kind of eager charm that usually caught human interest. He was simply existing, asymmetrical, imperfect, patient in the way of those who have learned that the world's approval is not a requirement for survival. In that moment, recognition passed between them like a secret. Two rejects, two afterthoughts, two beings shaped by the weight of other people's dismissal, neither beautiful by conventional standards, neither chosen by the voices that mattered to everyone else. But choice, Lyra was about to discover, works both ways. And sometimes the most revolutionary act is reaching toward the thing the world has decided isn't worth reaching for, including yourself. What began as an impulse of mercy would become a masterclass in the kind of love that doesn't ask permission, doesn't seek applause, doesn't apologize for existing. In choosing him, she would learn to choose herself. In saving him, she would discover that salvation had always been a collaborative effort. Some stories begin with fairy tale promises. This one begins with the radical act of believing that broken things can be home for each other, and that the most profound transformations happen not in moments of grand revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of days when someone chooses to stay. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The rain against the shelter's windows sounded like impatience. Sharp, relentless, demanding attention that nobody wanted to give. Lyra Ashenfall pressed her cloth deeper into the stainless steel bowl, scrubbing away the remnants of kibble and neglect, while the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune of weariness above her head. 22 years old, and this was her soundtrack, the mechanical drone of necessity, punctuated by the occasional whimper from the kennels that lined the far wall. "You're staying late again." Marcus, the shelter supervisor, appeared beside her with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Alpha energy radiated from him like heat from a furnace, not unpleasant, but impossible to ignore. "Don't you have somewhere better to be on a Friday night?" Lyra kept scrubbing, her shoulders automatically rounding inward. The evening shift volunteers called in sick. Someone needs to finish the feeding rotation. Right. Marcus leaned against the metal counter, his presence filling the small prep kitchen. "Well, don't stay too late. Lock up when you're done." She nodded without looking up, waiting for his footsteps to fade, before allowing her spine to straighten. This was how she moved through the world, compressed, apologetic, taking up only the space that was absolutely necessary. In a city that treated Omega status like a character flaw, she had learned early that visibility was dangerous. Better to be helpful, better to be forgettable. The shelter fell into its evening rhythm around her. Volunteers filtered out in pairs and small groups, their voices carrying across the lobby as they made weekend plans that sounded bright and spontaneous. Lyra listened while she worked, the way she always did, not quite included, not entirely excluded, existing in the comfortable shadow between belonging and being alone. By 7 o'clock, the building had emptied except for the animals and the quiet settling sounds of a place designed for temporary stays. Lyra made her rounds with practiced efficiency, checking water bowls, adjusting blankets, offering soft words to the dogs who pressed themselves against the kennel doors for attention. She knew each of their stories. The retrievers surrendered for being too energetic, the pit bull mixes who couldn't escape their breed's reputation, the seniors whose families had decided they were too much trouble. It was in the back corner. In the kennel, everyone pretended not to see that she found him. He was smaller than the others, maybe 30 pounds at most, with fur that couldn't decide what color it wanted to be. Brown in some places, gray in others, with patches of white that seemed randomly distributed across his body like an artist had gotten distracted halfway through. His left ear stood up while his right one flopped down, and there was something slightly asymmetrical about his face that made volunteers and potential adopters look quickly away. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with the kind of resigned patience that comes from understanding rejection as a fact of life rather than a possibility. He wasn't pressing against the kennel door like the others. He wasn't barking or wagging or performing any of the behaviors that usually caught human attention. He was simply sitting in the back corner of his space, watching her with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Hey there," Lyra whispered, crouching down to his eye level. The pup's ears twitched. Both of them, the lopsided movement somehow endearing, but he didn't move closer. "What's your story?" She reached for the clipboard hanging beside his kennel. The intake form was sparse. Male, approximately 18 months old, brought in as a stray 3 weeks ago. No microchip, no collar, no indication that anyone had ever claimed him as theirs. At the bottom, someone had scrawled a note in Marcus's handwriting. Behavioral evaluation pending. Low adoption probability. 3 weeks. In shelter time, that was already a lifetime. "Has anyone even looked at you?" she asked, settling fully onto the floor. The concrete was cold through her jeans, but she didn't mind. The pup tilted his head slightly, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw recognition flicker in his expression, as if he understood that she was the kind of person who sat on dirty floors to have conversations with animals nobody wanted. "Lyra?" The voice came from behind her, high and bright with the kind of confidence that had never known a moment's doubt. She turned to see Jessica Morningvale, one of the weekend volunteers, approaching with her perfect alpha girlfriend trailing behind. Both were dressed for downtown clubs, their makeup flawless and their energy crackling with the anticipation of a night full of possibilities. "Oh, honey," Jessica continued, glancing at the pup with the kind of expression usually reserved for roadkill. "You're not seriously considering that one, are you?" Heat crept up Lyra's neck. "I was just checking on him." "Good," Jessica's girlfriend chimed in. "Claire," Lyra remembered, "because honestly, someone like you deserves so much better. There are puppies here that are actually, you know." She gestured vaguely at the kennels holding the more conventionally attractive dogs. "Adoptable. Someone like you." The words settled in Lyra's stomach like stones. Someone quiet. Someone grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way. Someone who should be thankful for the privilege of being tolerated by people like Jessica and Claire. "I mean, look at him," Jessica laughed. Not unkindly, but with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned their right to judge. "Poor thing looks like he was put together from spare parts. And that face." She shook her head. "He'll probably be here forever. It's actually kind of sad." The pup's ears flattened slightly, and something fierce and unexpected flared in Lyra's chest. She stood up slowly, her hand already reaching for her wallet. "How much are the adoption fees?" she asked. Jessica blinked. "Wait, what?" "Lyra, you can't be serious." But she was serious. Standing there in the harsh fluorescent lighting, looking at this broken, asymmetrical creature who had learned to expect nothing and ask for less, she had never been more serious about anything in her life, because she recognized something in his careful stillness, in the way he watched the world without demanding its attention. She recognized herself. "The adoption fee is $60, she said, more to herself than to Jessica, plus supplies, food, leash, collar, toys. She was already doing the math in her head, calculating against her grocery budget, her utility bills, the margin of safety she tried to maintain between paycheck and poverty. "Lyra, think about this," Claire said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that alphas used when they thought an omega was making an emotional decision. "Dogs are a huge responsibility, and this one, he might have health problems, behavioral issues. You live in that tiny apartment and you work so much. Maybe you should wait until when?" Lyra interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Until someone better comes along? Until I deserve something prettier?" The silence that followed was thick with uncomfortable truth. Jessica and Claire exchanged a look that communicated volumes, the kind of wordless conversation that people have when they realize they've accidentally revealed more about themselves than they intended. "We didn't mean," Jessica started. "It's fine," Lyra said, though it wasn't. Not really. She pulled her debit card from her wallet with fingers that trembled slightly. "I know exactly what you meant. The adoption process took 47 minutes. Paperwork, background checks, a conversation with Marcus, who emerged from his office looking puzzled and slightly concerned. Through it all, the pup waited in his kennel with that same patient stillness, as if he had learned not to invest hope in human promises. When Marcus finally handed her the leash and collar, bright red, the color of optimism, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that sometimes the most important choices are the ones nobody else understands. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, his alpha instincts clearly telling him to protect her from her own impulses. "He's been through a lot. It might take some time to adjust." Lyra knelt beside the kennel as Marcus opened the door. The pup didn't bound out like the others would have. Instead, he stepped forward carefully, cautiously, his dark eyes moving between her face and the leash in her hands, as if trying to decode whether this was real or just another disappointment waiting to unfold. "Hey," she whispered, holding out her hand palm up. "Want to come home with me?" His nose twitched as he scented her fingers, soap and anxiety and something else, something that smelled like understanding. After a long moment, he took one step closer, then another, until his warm breath was ghosting across her knuckles. She clipped the leash to his collar with hands that had stopped shaking, and together they walked toward the exit. Behind them, she could hear Jessica and Claire murmuring to each other in voices pitched low enough for plausible deniability, but loud enough for her Omega hearing to catch every word. "Really think she should have. Probably won't last a month. Honestly, kind of tragic." The rain had stopped by the time they reached the parking lot, but the air still smelled like wet concrete and possibility. Lyra's car was a 12-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door and seats that had seen better decades. But when she opened the back door, the pup climbed in without hesitation, as if luxury had never been something he expected anyway. "We need to figure out a name for you," she said, adjusting her rearview mirror to see him. He had settled onto the worn upholstery with his head resting on his paws, watching the world pass by through rain-streaked windows. Something that fits. The drive to her apartment took 15 minutes through streets lined with the kind of businesses that stayed open late for people who worked odd hours. Laundromats and convenience stores and diners with neon signs that flickered like tired heartbeats. Her building was nothing special. A 4-story brick structure wedged between a dry cleaner and a shop that sold used appliances. But it was hers in the way that rented spaces become home when you're careful with them. "5th floor," she told him as they climbed the narrow stairwell, his nails clicking against linoleum that had probably been installed sometime in the 1980s. "Sorry about the stairs. The elevator's been broken since I moved in." Her apartment was exactly what $6,700 a year could buy in this part of the city. 500 square feet, divided into rooms that served multiple purposes. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, office, bathroom that doubled as a laundry area when she dragged the portable washing machine out from behind the toilet. But the windows faced east, which meant morning light, and she had painted the walls a warm cream color that made the space feel larger than it was. The pup stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in with the methodical attention of someone cataloging escape routes and safe spaces. Then, as if reaching some internal decision, he stepped inside and immediately went to the corner farthest from the door, not hiding exactly, but positioning himself where he could see everything while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. "Smart," Lyra murmured, recognizing the strategy. She had perfected the same technique in group settings, finding the spots where she could observe without drawing attention, contribute without taking up too much space. "You can stay there as long as you need to." She spent the next hour setting up the supplies she had bought at the pet store attached to the shelter. Food and water bowls, a bed that was probably too large for her apartment but too small for his eventual size, toys that looked bright and hopeful against her secondhand furniture. Through it all, he watched from his corner, occasionally shifting position, but never moving more than a few feet from his chosen spot. It wasn't until she sat down on her couch with a cup of tea and a sandwich that smelled like cheap deli turkey that he made his first real move toward her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could see the way his nostrils flared as he took in the scent of her dinner. "Oh," she said, sudden understanding hitting her. "You're probably starving." She had fed him at the shelter, but that had been hours ago, and who knew how consistent his meals had been before that. She opened the bag of kibble she had bought, the good kind, with real meat as the first ingredient, not the generic brand she probably should have chosen given her budget, and poured it into his new bowl. He approached it like someone who had learned that food could disappear as quickly as it appeared, eating with focused efficiency while keeping one eye on her. When he finished, he licked the bowl clean, and then, for the first time since she had brought him home, looked directly at her, with something that might have been gratitude. "Better?" she asked. His tail gave a single, tentative wag. It was past 11 when she finally turned off the lights and headed toward her bedroom. The pup had claimed the spot beside the couch as his own, curled into a tight ball on the area rug she had bought at a thrift store 3 months after moving in. He lifted his head when she passed, watching her with alert attention. "Good night," she said softly. "Sleep well." She left the bedroom door cracked open, an invitation without pressure, and settled into bed with the strange new awareness that she was no longer alone in her small, carefully ordered world. Outside, the city hummed its usual lullaby of distant traffic and late-night conversations, but inside her apartment, there was a different kind of quiet. The quiet of two creatures who had found each other not through any grand design, but through the simple recognition that sometimes being unwanted by everyone else is exactly what makes you perfect for someone. As she drifted towards sleep, Lyra thought about names, something that honored where he had come from without defining where he might go. Something that acknowledged his imperfections, without making them the whole story. From the living room came the soft sound of shifting fabric as he adjusted his position on the rug, followed by a contented sigh that sounded remarkably like home. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would figure out what to call him. Tonight, it was enough that he was here. Lyra woke to the sound of whimpering. For a moment, suspended in the gray space between sleep and consciousness, she thought she was dreaming. But the soft, distressed sounds coming from her living room were too real, too immediate to be anything her subconscious had conjured. She rolled over to check her phone, 3:17 in the morning, and felt her heart contract with sudden worry. The pup was exactly where she had left him, curled on the area rug beside her couch, but something was wrong. Even in the dim light filtering through her east-facing windows, she could see the way his body was trembling, the rapid rise and fall of his chest that spoke of distress rather than dreams. "Hey," she whispered, padding barefoot across the cold linoleum. "What's happening?" He lifted his head at the sound of her voice, and she saw that his eyes were wide and unfocused, reflecting the streetlight glow with an intensity that made her stomach clench. When she knelt beside him, she could feel heat radiating from his small body like warmth from a malfunctioning radiator. Fever. High fever. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, her hand hovering just above his head. She had read enough about dog adoption to know that stress could compromise immune systems, that the transition from shelter to home could trigger illnesses that had been lying dormant. But reading about it and experiencing it at 3 in the morning in her tiny apartment were entirely different things. She pressed her palm gently against his forehead, confirming what she already knew. His fur was damp with perspiration, his breathing shallow and quick. When she tried to coax him to drink from his water bowl, he turned his head away with the listless indifference of someone too sick to care about survival. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to him. "Okay, we can handle this." But could they? The emergency vet clinic was across town, and even if she could afford the after-hours fees, which she probably couldn't, she wasn't sure he was stable enough for the car ride. Her hands shook as she grabbed her laptop and began searching for guidance, scrolling through forums and veterinary websites while he continued his soft, heartbreaking whimpers behind her. Most of the advice was the same. Monitor temperature, encourage hydration, seek professional help if symptoms worsened. What constituted worsening when your dog was already burning up and refusing water at 3 in the morning? What did you do when professional help meant choosing between rent money and the life of a creature who had already been abandoned once? She spent the next 4 hours in a vigil she hadn't known she was capable of. Every 20 minutes, she checked his temperature with a digital thermometer she found buried in her medicine cabinet, watching the numbers fluctuate between concerning and terrifying. She tried to get him to drink water from a syringe, managing to get a few milliliters down his throat before he turned away again. She called the emergency vet hotline twice, listening to hold music that sounded obscenely cheerful while her heart hammered against her ribs. Temperature spikes are common in the first week after adoption. The veterinary technician told her during the second call, her voice professional but not unkind. Stress can manifest in physical symptoms. As long as he's alert and responsive, you can probably wait until morning for a regular appointment. Alert and responsive. Lyra looked at the pup, who had barely lifted his head in the past hour, whose breathing sounded labored even to her untrained ears. She made an appointment for 8:30 and tried not to think about what she would do if he didn't make it that long. By 5 a.m, something shifted. Not recovery, not yet, but a stabilization that felt like the first deep breath after drowning. His temperature dropped 0.5 degree. He accepted a few more milliliters of water. When she spoke to him, his eyes tracked her movement with something that looked like recognition. "There you are," she whispered, settling onto the floor beside his makeshift bed. I was getting scared. She must have dozed off sitting up, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through her windows, and something warm and slightly damp was pressing against her hand. She opened her eyes to find the pup's nose nudging her fingers, his tail giving a weak but unmistakable wag. "Hi," she said, her voice hoarse from the long night. "How are you feeling?" His response was to struggle to his feet and take 2 unsteady steps toward his water bowl, where he drank for the first time in 8 hours. Not much, just enough to wet his throat, but it was progress. It was hope. The veterinary clinic was a 15-minute drive through Saturday morning traffic, past coffee shops filled with people who looked well-rested, and cafes where couples shared newspapers over elaborate breakfast plates. Lyra felt like she was moving through a parallel universe, one where other people's biggest concern was whether to order the avocado toast or the eggs Benedict, while she sat in her car with a sick animal and a checking account balance that made her stomach hurt almost as much as her worry. Doctor. Patricia Valdez had the kind of competent, no-nonsense energy that made Lyra feel immediately better about her decision to wait until morning. She examined the pup with gentle efficiency, checking his temperature, listening to his heart, palpating his abdomen while he submitted to her attention with the resignation of someone who had learned that resistance was pointless. Shelter stress syndrome, she announced after 10 minutes of examination. Very common in the first week after adoption, especially in animals who have experienced trauma or multiple relocations. His immune system is basically having a panic attack. "Is he going to be okay?" Lyra asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "With supportive care, absolutely. Antibiotics to prevent secondary infection, probiotics to support his digestive system, and lots of rest in a stable environment." Dr. Valdez handed her a prescription and a care sheet. "The key is consistency. Same routine, same person providing care, minimal stress. Think of it as helping his nervous system remember how to trust that tomorrow will be similar to today." The medication cost $93. Lyra paid with her debit card and tried not to calculate how many cups of ramen noodles that represented, how many weeks of careful budgeting it would take to rebuild her emergency fund. As they walked back to the car, the pup seemed stronger already, his steps more confident, his attention turning outward toward the world instead of inward toward survival. "Home?" she asked, and his tail wagged with enough enthusiasm to make her throat tight with relief. The apartment felt different when they returned, smaller somehow, but also more permanent. She set up his recovery area in the living room, moving furniture to create a quiet space where he could rest without being completely isolated. He settled onto his bed with a sigh that sounded like gratitude, accepting the first dose of antibiotics with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes medicine came in forms that didn't taste good. It was while she was preparing his lunch, a bland mixture of boiled chicken and rice that Dr. Valdez had recommended, that she realized she still hadn't named him. She had been thinking of him as the pup for 36 hours now, as if giving him a name would make this whole situation more real, more permanent, more likely to break her heart if something went wrong. But he wasn't going anywhere. Despite the fever, despite the medication, despite the fact that she was probably in over her head financially and emotionally, he was hers now in a way that transcended paperwork and adoption fees. "What do you think?" she asked him as she set his bowl down. "You feel like a Charlie? A Max? Something traditional?" He ate with more appetite than he had shown since coming home, his tail giving occasional wags that suggested his stomach was finally settling. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes that were clearer than they had been all morning, and something about his expression, patient, intelligent, slightly asymmetrical, made her smile. "Brum," she said suddenly. "That's what I'm going to call you. Brum." The name felt right in her mouth, solid and unpretentious. Not a name that tried to make him into something he wasn't, but one that acknowledged exactly what he was. Imperfect, resilient, hers. Brum's ears perked up at the sound of it, his head tilting in that lopsided way that was already becoming familiar. Then, for the first time since she had brought him home, he stood up and walked over to where she was sitting, settling down beside her with his shoulder pressed against her leg. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There were no movie moment revelations, no sudden transformations. Just a small, asymmetrical dog choosing to be close to the person who had chosen him, in an apartment that smelled like chicken and rice and the particular kind of quiet that comes after crisis has passed. But it was enough. As Lyra sat there with Brum's warm weight against her leg, watching the afternoon light paint patterns on her secondhand furniture, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside her windows, the city continued its Saturday rhythm. People running errands, meeting friends, living lives that looked effortless and bright. But inside her small apartment, two creatures who had learned to expect disappointment were discovering something neither had dared to hope for, that sometimes being unwanted by everyone else is exactly what makes you perfect for someone. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of small victories. Brum's appetite returned fully by Sunday morning. His temperature stabilized. He began showing interest in the toys she had bought, carrying a rope toy around the apartment like a trophy. Most importantly, he started seeking out her company, not desperately, not with the frantic attachment of abandonment issues, but with the steady confidence of someone who was beginning to believe that good things could last. On Sunday evening, as she prepared for another week of work at the shelter, Lyra realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself. For 22 years, she had moved through the world like an apology, sorry for taking up space, sorry for having needs, sorry for existing in ways that didn't make other people's lives easier. But watching Brum recover, seeing the way his tail wagged when she came home from the grocery store, feeling the solid warmth of his presence in her previously empty apartment, she was beginning to understand something new. Love didn't have to be earned. It didn't have to be deserved. Sometimes it just was, imperfect, asymmetrical, given freely between two creatures who recognized something essential in each other. As she settled into bed Sunday night, Brum curled up on his bed beside her couch. She listened to the sound of his even breathing and felt a peace she hadn't known she was missing. Tomorrow there would be work, bills to pay, the ongoing challenge of building a life on the margins of a world that valued different things than she did. But tonight, in her small apartment, with its east-facing windows and second-hand furniture, she was home in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with choosing to stay. From the living room came the soft sound of Brum shifting in his sleep, followed by a contented sigh that made her smile in the darkness. Yes, she thought, as sleep pulled her under. This was definitely home. 3 months later, Lyra was learning what it meant to live without apologies. It started small, the way most revolutions do. A moment at the shelter when Derek, one of the Alpha volunteers, made a joke about her charity case dog while she was cleaning kennels, and instead of laughing along or changing the subject, she looked him directly in the eyes and said, "His name is Brum, and he's not a charity case. He's family." The silence that followed was thick with surprise, not just from Derek but from herself. She had never spoken that directly to an Alpha before, had never claimed space in a conversation without first ensuring it wouldn't inconvenience anyone else. But something about the way Derek's dismissive laughter had made her chest burn with protective fury had unlocked a voice she hadn't known she possessed. "Okay," Derek had said after a moment, his tone carefully neutral. "Brum, got it." And that was it. No dramatic confrontation, no punishment for stepping out of her designated role, just acknowledgement, respect, and the dawning realization that she had been giving away her power for years, without anyone actually asking her to. The changes rippled outward from there, small but persistent. When her landlord raised her rent without adequate notice, she researched tenant rights instead of simply accepting the increase. When her supervisor at the shelter asked her to work unpaid overtime for the 3rd week in a row, She politely but firmly explained that she couldn't afford to donate that much of her time anymore. When Jessica made another comment about Brum's appearance, "I just think it's so sad that you settled," delivered with the kind of smile that was supposed to soften the cruelty, Lyra found herself responding with calm certainty. "I didn't settle," she said, scratching behind Brum's mismatched ears as he leaned against her legs. "I chose exactly what I wanted." The transformation wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines or inspire social media posts about self-actualization. Lyra still worked at the shelter, still lived in her small apartment, still bought generic cereal and calculated grocery budgets down to the dollar. But there was a steadiness to her now, a rootedness that came from having someone who needed her not for what she could provide or how convenient she could make herself, but simply for who she was. Brum had grown into his name and his place in their small world. His fever had been the last crisis. Everything after that was adjustment, adaptation, the slow building of trust between two creatures who had learned that safety was something you created rather than something you found. He still startled at loud noises, still positioned himself where he could see all the exits, still sometimes woke in the middle of the night, as if checking to make sure she was really there. But his tail wagged when she came home now, and he had claimed specific spots throughout the apartment as his own. The corner of the couch where the afternoon sun hit just right, the space beside her bed where he could monitor her sleep, the patch of kitchen linoleum where he waited with patient optimism while she prepared their meals. He wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. 3 months of good nutrition and veterinary care had filled him out and given his coat a healthier sheen, but they hadn't changed his fundamental asymmetry, the slight crookedness to his face that made people look away when they passed him on the street. What had changed was Lyra's relationship to that asymmetry, her understanding that beauty had less to do with proportion and more to do with the way someone's entire being lit up when they saw you coming home. "You know what I think?" she said to him one evening in late October as they settled into their nighttime routine. He was lying on his bed beside the couch, chin resting on his paws, watching her with the attentive presence that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "I think we saved each other." His tail thumped once against the floor. Not the frantic wagging of excitement, but the steady rhythm of contentment. Agreement, maybe. Or just the simple acknowledgement that he was listening, that her voice was one of the sounds that meant safety in his carefully reconstructed world. The evening ritual had evolved organically over the months they had lived together. Dinner first, his kibble supplemented with whatever vegetables she was having, because Dr. Valdez had said the extra nutrition would be good for his digestion. Then a walk around the neighborhood. Not the quick functional exercise she had initially planned, but a meandering exploration that had taught her things about her own streets she had never noticed, while rushing between destinations. Brum was a careful observer, stopping to investigate scents that told stories she couldn't read, greeting the regular cast of evening dog walkers with the polite reserve of someone who had learned to be social without being vulnerable. Tonight's walk took them past the community center, where she had started volunteering on Tuesday evenings, teaching basic computer skills to older adults who had been left behind by technology. It was work she had never imagined herself doing 6 months ago. Too visible. Too much risk of saying the wrong thing, or not knowing enough to be helpful. But something about watching Brum learn to trust had given her permission to try things that might not work out perfectly. "That's where I go on Tuesdays," she told him as they paused at the intersection. "Where I help people learn to use email and video calls to talk to their grandchildren." Brum looked up at her with those dark, intelligent eyes, and she could swear she saw approval there. Or maybe she was projecting, reading into his expression what she needed to see. But the feeling was real regardless. The sense that she was becoming someone worth approving of, someone whose choices reflected intention rather than just the path of least resistance. Back in the apartment, she made tea while Brum settled into his evening spot and began his nightly grooming routine. He was fastidious about cleanliness, something she attributed to his shelter experience, the need to maintain dignity when everything else was uncertain. She respected this about him, the way she had learned to respect all the small rituals and preferences that made up his personality. He liked his water bowl refilled completely rather than just topped off. He preferred sleeping where he could see both the front door and her bedroom doorway. He had claimed the left side of the couch as his own, and would politely but firmly reclaim it if she accidentally sat there while distracted. These weren't the behaviors of a broken animal learning to trust, she had realized somewhere around the 6-week mark. They were the preferences of an individual asserting his right to have preferences. establishing the boundaries that made shared space comfortable for everyone involved. "I learned that from you," she said aloud, settling onto the right side of the couch with her mug of chamomile tea. "The boundary thing, how you just decided what worked for you and stuck with it." It had taken her weeks to recognize the lesson, longer still to begin applying it to her own life. But once she started paying attention, she noticed how Brum never apologized for taking up space, never second-guessed his needs or tried to make himself more convenient for others. When he was tired, he slept. When he was hungry, he waited by his food bowl with patient expectation. When he wanted affection, he approached and made himself available for petting without demanding it or acting wounded if it didn't come immediately. There was something revolutionary about that kind of self-possession, especially for someone who had spent her entire life monitoring other people's comfort levels and adjusting her behavior accordingly. Watching Brum simply exist without apology had gradually given her permission to do the same. The shift had been most noticeable at work, where her interactions with both animals and people had taken on a quality of calm authority that surprised everyone, including herself. She found herself speaking up in staff meetings, offering suggestions based on her years of observation, rather than deferring to whoever spoke loudest. When potential adopters made dismissive comments about the less conventionally attractive animals, she responded with information about their personalities, their needs, their potential as companions, not defensively, but with the kind of matter-of-fact advocacy that came from understanding that every creature deserved to be seen fully. "I think," she said to Brum, who had finished his grooming, and was now watching her with the relaxed attention of someone settling in for the evening. "I'm finally figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to be what other people want." The revelation had come gradually, built from 1,000 small moments of choosing herself without apology. The morning she had refused to switch shifts with a coworker who wanted to attend a last-minute social event, explaining that she had plans with Brum, and those plans mattered. The afternoon she had left work exactly on time instead of staying late to finish tasks that weren't urgent, because she had realized that her unpaid overtime wasn't actually helping anyone. It was just enabling poor planning by people who took her availability for granted. The evening she had turned down a dinner invitation from Jessica and her girlfriend, not because she disliked them, but because she was learning to distinguish between social obligations and genuine connections. "The thing is," she continued, reaching down to scratch behind Brum's ears when he moved closer to the couch, "I don't think I was actually as nice as I thought I was. I think I was just afraid." This was the hardest truth, the one that had taken months of quiet self-examination to acknowledge. Her omega nature, her history of being overlooked and undervalued, those things were real, and they had shaped her in legitimate ways. But somewhere along the line, she had started using them as excuses, allowing her fear of rejection to masquerade as selfless accommodation. She had convinced herself that she was being considerate when she was actually just avoiding the risk of being disliked. Real consideration, she was learning, sometimes meant saying no. It meant being honest about your limits, clear about your needs, willing to disappoint people who had grown comfortable with your endless flexibility. It meant understanding that relationships built on one person's perpetual self-sacrifice weren't actually sustainable or healthy for anyone involved. Brum had taught her this without meaning to, simply by being himself without apology or explanation. He wasn't trying to prove his worth through service or accommodation. He wasn't performing gratitude or trying to make himself indispensable. He was just present, available for connection when it felt good, self-contained when it didn't, secure in the knowledge that he belonged in their shared space, regardless of what he contributed to it. "You know what the amazing thing is?" she said, setting down her empty mug and moving to the floor beside his bed. He immediately shifted position to accommodate her, resting his head on her lap with a contentment that still made her throat tight with emotion. "I think I'm becoming someone I actually like." It wasn't that she had disliked herself before, exactly. More that she had never really considered herself as a separate entity, someone with inherent value independent of her usefulness to others. She had existed in relationship to other people's needs and expectations, defined by what she could provide rather than who she was when nobody was watching. But living with Brum had forced her to confront the person she was, when the only witness was someone who couldn't judge her by conventional standards, who cared nothing for her social status or her ability to make other people comfortable. With him, she could be tired without being selfish, could have preferences without being difficult, could take up space without having to justify it. That version of herself, rested, boundaried, unapologetically present, had started showing up in other areas of her life. At work, where she had begun proposing policy changes based on years of observation, instead of just implementing whatever decisions were handed down to her. In her apartment, where she had started buying things she actually liked, instead of just the cheapest available options. In social situations, where she found herself speaking up when she disagreed instead of nodding along to maintain harmony. The changes were subtle enough that most people probably hadn't noticed, but they felt seismic to her, like the difference between holding your breath and breathing freely. "I got a promotion," she told Broom, the word still feeling surreal even though she had received the news 3 days ago. "Assistant coordinator. It comes with a raise in my own office. Well, a shared office, but still." Marcus had offered her the position during their quarterly review meeting, explaining that her insights into animal behavior and her rapport with both volunteers and adopters made her a natural fit for expanded responsibilities. What he probably didn't realize was that her newfound confidence hadn't emerged from thin air. It had grown from months of learning to advocate for a creature who couldn't advocate for himself, from discovering that protection was sometimes the most loving thing you could offer. Broom's tail thumped against the floor, and she chose to interpret it as congratulations. The raise would mean they could afford higher quality food, maybe even a savings account for veterinary emergencies. More importantly, it would mean she had choices, the kind of financial cushion that allowed for decisions based on preference rather than just survival. "We should celebrate," she said, though they both knew their idea of celebration was pretty much what they were already doing. Quiet evening, comfortable couch, the simple pleasure of being in the same space without needing anything from each other except presence. This, she had learned, was what contentment looked like. Not the dramatic happiness of movies or social media posts, but the steady satisfaction of a life built from intentional choices, small kindnesses, and the radical act of believing that you deserved to take up space in the world. Outside her windows, the city continued its nightly transformation from day to evening, streetlights flickering on and casting long shadows across the sidewalks, where other people walked their dogs, lived their lives, made their own small choices about who to be and how to love. Inside her apartment, Lyra sat on the floor beside her mismatched, asymmetrical, perfectly imperfect dog, and felt the deep peace that comes from finally understanding that you don't have to be chosen by everyone to be precious to someone. "Thank you," she whispered into Broom's fur, meaning it in ways that went far beyond gratitude for companionship. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about being perfect. Thank you for showing me that boundaries are acts of kindness. Thank you for proving that sometimes the most important choice is the one nobody else understands." Broom's breathing had shifted into the rhythm of sleep, his weight warm and solid against her legs. Tomorrow there would be work, responsibilities, the ongoing project of building a life that reflected her values rather than just her fears. But tonight, in her small apartment with its secondhand furniture and east-facing windows, she was home in the truest sense of the word, not because of where she was, but because of who she had become. Someone worth coming home to, someone worth staying for, someone who had learned, finally and completely, that the most revolutionary act is sometimes simply refusing to apologize for existing exactly as you are. As sleep began to pull her toward dreams, Lyra thought about the girl she had been 6 months ago, apologetic, invisible, convinced that her worth was determined by her willingness to disappear when convenient. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered with compassion but no longer recognized as herself. In her place was someone new, someone who had learned that love multiplies when you stop trying to earn it, that strength sometimes looks like sitting on the floor of an animal shelter and choosing the creature nobody else wants. That home isn't a place you find, but a life you build, one intentional choice at a time. From somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, she heard Broom sigh contentedly in his dreams, and smiled knowing that tomorrow they would wake up together in the life they had created. Imperfect, asymmetrical, absolutely perfect for them. 2 years later, the morning light filtered through the larger windows of their new apartment, casting golden rectangles across hardwood floors that Broom had claimed as his personal sunbathing territory. Lyra watched him from the kitchen as she prepared coffee in the French press she had finally allowed herself to buy, not because it was practical, but simply because she enjoyed the ritual of good coffee in the morning. "Ready for the big day?" she asked him. though they both knew his answer would be the same measured tail wag that had become his signature response to her morning conversations. Today marked the 2-year anniversary of the day she had brought him home, though they had been celebrating all week in small ways. A new toy on Monday, rope with actual knots, not the generic kind. His favorite treats on Wednesday, the expensive ones that came in the crinkly bag he loved to investigate. Yesterday, a longer walk through the neighborhood that had become truly theirs, where other dog owners greeted them by name, and where Broom had earned a reputation as the diplomatic one, who helped nervous rescues learn that not all dogs were threats. The apartment they shared now was twice the size of her old place, with a small balcony where Broom could survey his territory, and where she grew herbs in terracotta pots that had been marked down at the garden center. It wasn't luxury by anyone's standards, but it was space earned through intentional choices. The promotion that had led to another promotion, the freelance consulting work she had started doing for other shelters, the gradual accumulation of financial stability that came from learning to value her own expertise. More importantly, it was space that had been chosen rather than settled for, decorated with furniture they both used rather than pieces selected solely for their price tags. The couch was large enough for both of them, with Broom's official spot on the left and her reading corner on the right. The bedroom had room for his orthopedic bed, a concession to the hip dysplasia that had developed as he aged, manageable but requiring attention, positioned where he could see both doorways without having to lift his head. "You know what I realized yesterday?" she said, settling onto the floor beside him with her coffee mug. This had become their morning ritual, 10 minutes of quiet conversation before the day officially began. "I can't remember the last time someone told me I deserved better than you." It was true. Somewhere in the past 2 years, those comments had stopped coming, though she wasn't entirely sure when or why. Maybe it was because she had stopped giving people permission to diminish him with their casual cruelty. Maybe it was because her obvious contentment had made their pity seem misplaced. Or maybe it was simply that she had surrounded herself with people who understood that love wasn't a competition with objective winners and losers. The shelter had become a different place for her after her promotion to head coordinator, a position that came with the authority to implement the policy changes she had been quietly developing for years. The adoption process now included mandatory education about realistic expectations, and volunteers were trained to match families with animals based on lifestyle compatibility rather than just appearance. She had instituted a program pairing overlooked animals with experienced handlers who could help them develop confidence before meeting potential adopters. Basically, she had explained to the board of directors during her presentation, we're changing the narrative from, "This animal needs to be rescued," to "This animal has specific qualities that make them perfect for the right family." We're not asking people to settle. We're asking them to see value that others might have missed. The results had been measurable and deeply satisfying. Adoption rates for senior dogs had increased by 30%. Return rates had dropped significantly across all demographics. Most importantly, the culture of the shelter had shifted from one of pity to one of possibility, where staff talked about matching rather than placement, where every animal was discussed in terms of their strengths rather than their deficits. It had been her idea to partner with the local community college to offer a course called Understanding Animal Behavior for Shelter Volunteers, which she co-taught with Dr. Valdez on Thursday evenings. The class was always full, drawing not just volunteers but dog owners who wanted to better understand their companions, teenagers considering veterinary careers, and older adults who had adopted their first pets after retirement. "The thing about animals who have been rejected," she had said during last week's session, "is that they often develop remarkable emotional intelligence. They learn to read human moods, to offer comfort when it's needed, to be present without being demanding. These aren't deficits to overcome, they're skills to appreciate." After class, a woman in her 60s had approached with tears in her eyes. "I adopted a senior dog last month, and I keep worrying that I'm not giving him the life he deserves. But listening to you talk, maybe he's giving me exactly the life I deserve." These conversations happened regularly now, people seeking her out for advice, not just about animal behavior, but about the philosophy behind her approach to rescue work. She had started writing articles for shelter industry publications, speaking at conferences, consulting with organizations that wanted to replicate her programs. The shy Omega, who had once apologized for taking up space, was now someone whose expertise was sought after, whose voice carried weight in discussions about animal welfare and adoption practices. But the transformation she was most proud of was visible right here, in the way Broom stretched luxuriously in his patch of morning sunlight, secure in the knowledge that this was his home, in the most permanent sense possible. He had grown into his middle age with dignity, his asymmetrical face now distinguished rather than unfortunate, his patient demeanor recognized by everyone who met him as wisdom rather than resignation. "Dr. Valdez says your hip is stable," she told him, running her fingers through his graying fur. "But we're going to start the supplements anyway, just to be proactive." He lifted his head to look at her with those dark eyes that had never lost their intelligence, their capacity for connection. At 4 years old, he was firmly settled into his personality, calm, observant, selectively social, unshakably loyal to the person who had chosen him, when choosing him made no sense to anyone else. He tolerated other dogs, enjoyed the attention of children who approached him respectfully, and had become something of a therapy dog for the nervous animals who came through the shelter's rehabilitation program. "You know what Marcus said yesterday?" she continued, scratching behind his ears in the spot that made his back leg twitch with pleasure. "He said you changed the culture of the whole shelter, not just because I learned things from living with you, but because you proved that the animals everyone overlooks are often the most rewarding to work with." It was true. Broom had become something of a mascot at the shelter, where he spent Tuesday afternoons helping socialize anxious dogs and teaching volunteers how to read subtle body language. His presence seemed to communicate something essential to both animals and humans. That being different wasn't a failure, that taking time to trust was a sign of intelligence rather than damage, that the most profound connections often developed slowly and without fanfare. The doorbell rang, interrupting their morning ritual. Broom's ears perked up, both of them, in that lopsided way that still made her smile, and his tail began the measured wag that meant, "Visitor I recognize and approve of." "That's probably Sarah," Lyra said, checking her watch. Sarah Chen was a journalist, writing a feature story about innovative shelter programs, and she was scheduled to interview Lyra this morning before observing the afternoon rehabilitation session. "Wanna say hello?" Broom stood and stretched, then trotted toward the front door with the dignified gait that had replaced his earlier nervous skittering. He positioned himself beside the door, close enough to greet their guest, but far enough away to avoid any accidental overwhelming of personal space. Even his welcomes were considerate. Sarah turned out to be a woman in her 30s, with a warm smile and a digital recorder that she handled with the casual competence of someone who had conducted hundreds of interviews. But what caught Lyra's attention was the way she immediately crouched to Broom's eye level, extending her hand palm up for him to investigate, rather than reaching straight for his head. "This must be the famous Broom," she said, waiting for his permission before offering gentle scratches. "I've heard amazing things about your work at the shelter." "He's the real expert," Lyra said, feeling the familiar warmth that came from watching someone see Broom clearly, appreciate him for exactly what he was. "I just learned to pay attention to what he was teaching." The interview lasted 2 hours, covering everything from the practical details of her programs to the philosophical shifts that had made them possible. Sarah's questions were thoughtful, demonstrating that she had done her research and understood that this wasn't just a feel-good story about rescued animals, but a case study in changing institutional culture through empathy and evidence-based practices. "What would you say to someone who's considering adopting an animal that others have passed over?" Sarah asked toward the end of their conversation. Lyra looked at Broom, who had spent the interview lying quietly beside her chair, offering his presence without demanding attention, the same gift he had been giving her for 2 years now. "I'd say that sometimes the most important choice you can make is the one nobody else understands," she said finally. "Not because it's rebellious or dramatic, but because it's honest about what you actually need, rather than what you think you should want." After Sarah left, promising to send a draft of the article for review, Lyra and Broom settled back into their morning routine. She had administrative work to catch up on before heading to the shelter, and he had serious napping to accomplish in his favorite spot by the balcony door. But first, she wanted to mark the anniversary properly. 2 years, she said, settling onto the floor beside him one more time. 2 years since I walked into that shelter and found you waiting in the corner, not asking for anything, not expecting anything. Broom's tail thumped once against the hardwood floor. "I used to think that was sad," she continued, "the way you had learned not to hope. But I think I understand now that it wasn't resignation. It was dignity. You weren't giving up. You were just refusing to perform for people who couldn't see your value." Outside their windows, The city was fully awake now. People walking dogs, heading to work, living lives that looked effortless from a distance, but were probably built from the same small daily choices that had created the life she and Broom shared. Some of those people were probably struggling with the same questions she had struggled with 2 years ago. How do you know what you're worth? How do you choose yourself when the world keeps suggesting you shouldn't? How do you build a life that feels authentic rather than just acceptable? She didn't have universal answers to those questions, but she had learned that sometimes the answer came not from thinking your way to clarity, but from making one choice that felt true, and then learning to trust the person that choice revealed you to be. "Thank you," she said to Broom, meaning it in all the ways she had ever meant it, and several new ones besides. "Thank you for teaching me that love is not a competition. Thank you for showing me that strength can look like patience. Thank you for proving that home is something you create together, one ordinary day at a time." Broom shifted position slightly, resting his graying muzzle on her knee with the casual affection that had replaced his earlier careful distance. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and his ears twitched with mild interest before dismissing it as not his concern. This was what happiness looked like, Lyra realized. Not the dramatic joy of movies or the curated contentment of social media, but the deep satisfaction of a life built from intentional choices, daily kindnesses, and the revolutionary act of believing that you deserve to take up space in the world exactly as you are. She had meetings to attend, programs to coordinate, people to help understand that every creature deserves to be seen fully. Broom had naps to take, sunbeams to claim, and the important work of simply being himself without apology. But for now, in the golden light of their chosen home, they were exactly where they belonged. Two imperfect beings who had found in each other not salvation, but recognition, not rescue, but the radical gift of being known completely and loved anyway. The world outside continued its complicated dance of connection and rejection, hope and disappointment, people looking for home in all the places they thought it should be. But inside this apartment, with its hardwood floors and east-facing windows, home had arrived in the form of a choice nobody else had understood, and had grown, day by ordinary day, into something neither of them could have imagined, but both of them had always deserved. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.